You can actually tell the difference between a pro-Israel and an anti-Israel demonstration without mentioning Israel, Palestine, Arabs, Jews, nothing. Do they fly American flags or burn American flags? Are the police there to protect the world from them or to protect them from the world?
Hi again, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Narrative. Mike Andrews, Aaron Baer, and we're pleased to let you know that we don't have to put up with David Mahan this week. He is in parts unknown, traveling back from some speaking engagements. In all seriousness, we miss David. We look forward to having him back here next week. But Aaron, I mentioned last week in a very short introduction to our comments from the Columbus Gala that there's been a lot going on in the state of Ohio and just some things we needed to catch our listeners up on. And even since last week, there's been more stuff added on to that, especially around House Bill 68, the lawsuit that's going through Franklin County that the ACLU brought to try and keep that law from becoming effective. And they've done so successfully now with two rulings from Judge Michael Holbrook in Franklin County. So there's so many moving pieces. I'm a little out of my depth on that, and I'm going to just toss it over to you and let you sink or swim, and I'll kind of play the audience's part. And as I need to ask questions for clarification, I'll do that. So let her rip. Tell us where we are with House Bill 68 right now.
Well, again, it's easier to be nice to David when he's not on the podcast with us, because when he's here and we compliment David, you literally see his head just like grow 3 sizes that day.
Our podcast studio is not that big. We
cannot contain it. But I think since the release of Vital Signs, the response has been incredible, and a lot of folks have been reaching out asking for people to come speak. And I think this is one of these things why I love having David working alongside David so much, is that he has such a heart to expose this and challenge the church. I'd want to say, I know I was looking at some of the replies we got from the left when Vital Signs was released, and there was this one liberal blogger that was like, why would they, because again, the numbers aren't good, right? And they were kind of saying, why would CCV release these numbers? It's embarrassing that, Christians voted this way to them. And again, like that's exactly that's the whole point here. And we're not here to paint a rosy picture to be able to fundraise on all these great stuff. We want to really engage the church on, hey guys, we got problems and we can't fix it if we don't diagnose it and begin to realize what the road to build back on. And I think that's what you see David doing right now. So grateful for him and just grateful for, again, the response to Vital Signs. And I think the awakening that we're seeing happening in the church because of it, and the opportunity it presents to really start changing some hearts and minds and hopefully culture around the issue.
Let me just jump right in and mention an email that I got around Vital Signs. It was from someone who used to work in the pro-life movement, I think down in Cincinnati. And after we released the report this past week, I think it was a media inquiry, wanted to set up an interview with you, Aaron, and their email said, I worked in this movement. Some of these stats are not surprising. Some of them were shocking. And for anybody who missed that release or hasn't seen Vital Signs yet, ccv.org/vital signs. You can download that report. You can look at it yourself. We're going to do a special live stream. Probably by the time the podcast hits, you're not necessarily going to be able to catch the live stream portion of that, but I'd love to make the recording available for you to watch and to get your hands on. We'll get physical copies to your church. We want to get the word on this out. You need to really understand what is in this report, and especially go back and listen to our podcast from a couple weeks ago where we outlined some of these major issues. But this is I think we're seeing the first tremors of this being a very impactful report for the state of Ohio and specifically the church.
House Bill 68. We are in just sort of the legal weeds right now on this. And I know there's been quite a bit, and I'm literally checking my email right now because we could get another decision or action in this case any moment, any day, or it could be quite a while before something else happens. But there was an alert that we sent out this week telling people on the status of things. So let me lay the foundation, just reset what's been going on with this, and that'll get us to what has happened this week and what the big thing we're waiting for. We're waiting on one really big thing here. So again, back in January, the General Assembly overrode Mike DeWine's veto of House Bill 68, which contains the SAFE Act and Save Women's Sports Act. The ACLU promised and then eventually brought a lawsuit on behalf of two families in Franklin County Court, right? So keep in mind, there's two court systems in America. There's your state court and there's your federal court. They brought this in state court, and so they brought it in Franklin County Court in particular to basically say this law is unconstitutional under the state constitution. And they brought three different claims. We walked through what those claims were on a previous episode. Judge Michael Holbrook, in that case, who's the judge that got assigned the case, he issued what was called a temporary restraining order, or a TRO, blocking that law from taking effect. And blocking it in a very broad manner, what I would say an illegally broad manner, on some technical grounds that was really unprecedented in many ways, right? I think the two things in particular that really jumped out on the broadness of this was one, just days before was a U.S. Supreme Court decision. Now, again, even though this is a state court judge, a county court judge, they're still subject, right? They still have to follow the guidelines of the U.S. Supreme Court, especially on procedural things and things like that. There was just a U.S. Supreme Court decision that said, listen, when you're issuing things like a temporary restraining order or a preliminary injunction, and I'll explain the difference between those two things, when you're issuing those things, you should try to make it as narrow as possible, because typically what the purpose of a TRO or a preliminary injunction is, we're going to pause the law while we have a full hearing, a full trial on the merits, on the bigger picture questions here, right? And that's where you get expert witnesses coming in and all of that type of action happening in a trial. And that could take months, if not typically years. And so a TRO, preliminary injunction, says, hey, we're going to pause this. We actually think this lawsuit is likely going to be successful, so we're going to pause this law from going into effect while we do that full trial on the merits. And what the Supreme Court said, hey, listen, that's fine if you're issuing TROs and preliminary injunctions, but they should be very narrow, right? So you should only, typically, if you have two people bringing a challenge, you can issue that TRO or preliminary injunction, but it should only apply to those parties instead of these huge statewide blocks that had been coming down. That was what Justice Gorsuch in particular said in the ruling opinion. The second aspect of the TRO that was really broad that Judge Holbrook issued was that he blocked all of the aspects of House Bill 68, not just the parts that the families were challenging. So the families that brought this lawsuit that the ACLU brought on behalf of, they were bringing their lawsuit specifically went after the SAFE Act portion, so the trans medicine portion. It didn't mention athletics. And so that was pretty absurd that the judge went through, though, and blocked both aspects of the bill, all aspects of the bill, I should say, not just the trans medicine, but also the athletics portion, right? So because that TRO was so broad, Attorney General Yost took pretty aggressive but necessary and amazing action. I cannot give General Yost enough credit for what he did. And he filed what's called a mandamus action with the state Supreme Court. Basically, just imagine if this is such an absurd situation, it requires us to skip over most of the typical process and take it straight to the Supreme Court to get justice. These types of actions are very rare, and they don't succeed a lot, which is part of the reason why they're very rare. But we think this has a high likelihood of success because procedurally, what Judge Holbrook did here was absurd. Also, in that, people probably noticed a release we put out last week about a family that was asking to intervene, saying, hey, we want to be a part of this lawsuit too. They asked the Supreme Court to intervene in Attorney General Yost's filing mandamus action to the Supreme Court, saying, hey, we actually have a daughter who is in ninth grade. and still has athletic competitions this spring, and obviously we'll have more athletic competitions next year. We live in Franklin County, and it's absurd that Judge Holbrook blocked these protections for a fair playing field for our daughter when that wasn't even the question before them, right? So that was the motion to intervene that came in, right? And that was a really important motion to intervene because it's really going to highlight to the Supreme Court, hey, there's actual harm being done to other people by Judge Holbrook's breaking of process and procedure. So that was all things that happened last week. Then what happened this week was Judge Holbrook's initial order was called a temporary restraining order. And this is sort of, you kind of have sort of a sequence of processes that happen when you're going to block a bill, right? Mm-hmm. You first have what's called a TRO, a temporary restraining order that's issued. And a TRO is typically just a matter of a few weeks, right? So it's the judge saying, okay, just based off your initial filings, I think there might be good reason that your lawsuit is going to be successful. So I'm just going to block this law for a few weeks. And then I want to have some more briefing come out on whether I should issue a longer block of the law, which is called a preliminary injunction. Preliminary injunctions can go on for years on end. This is an important aspect of this case. In federal court, you can appeal a preliminary injunction right away, and you can really get a PI overturned or appealed pretty quickly by going up to the circuit courts and then eventually the U.S. Supreme Court potentially. In Ohio, we don't really have the right to appeal preliminary injunctions typically. This is one of the reasons why the ACLU brought their lawsuit in state court instead of federal court, is that they wanted to, they recognize, hey, these PIs can last for a year. So even if we're going to ultimately lose this case, we can at least block the law for a time being. So what happened this week was Judge Holbrook, while the state Supreme Court is considering this mandamus action from Yost, back down at the Franklin County Court, where Judge Holbrook's still actively considering this question, he basically take that TRO and issued a preliminary injunction, right? So all of that litigation happening in Franklin County Court is still ongoing in the normal process while Attorney General Yost's mandamus action question before the state Supreme Court is happening, right? So really all that happened this week was the block that was in place is now issued in a more semi-permanent block, right? So it's still a question that's going to be litigated and debated through the court process. But most importantly is the state Supreme Court at any time could respond to Attorney General Yost's mandamus action and say, hey, Judge Holbrook, your TRO, now your preliminary injunction, is too broad, is unconstitutionally too broad. You need to limit that in this way. Or they might just say, you can't have any TRO or PI. There's not a high likelihood of success here. So you should pull that back altogether, and this law should be in effect in totality. And that's what we're hoping for. Now, what we've seen time and time again is the state Supreme Court operates on no man's time. They have no obligation. They don't even really have to respond. They typically do in some manner, and they can respond whenever they want, right? So I think it's very reasonable to think we could get a response as we're recording right now, Mike. Or we might not get a response for weeks or months or who knows when. But that's the question. I hope I made it more clear, but I might have just made everything much more complicated.
It's as clear as it was to me before we started. How about that? But no, in all fairness, I've heard this before, and it's been very helpful for me to process as we're providing the press releases and things like that. One question that occurs that our audience might have, since one of the questions that Judge Holbrook was considering was that, is this more than a single issue law, and is that against the Ohio Constitution? Is there anything that gives credence to that in this motion to the state Supreme Court about the Save Women's Sports aspect of it? And I'm just asking to play devil's advocate. And
that's a great question. And this is again what the ACLU is doing here is they're playing word games, right? they're playing semantic games, because we do have this thing called a single subject requirement, right? That a law has to be based around a single subject, right? So you're not just piling things in. Now, again, the vast majority of the time, a lot of folks I don't want to say the vast majority of the time, but often at the State House, that single subject requirement is interpreted very loosely, right? But what the nature of their claim is, well, listen, you have two bills here. You have two things here that were separate bills, and they each have their own name called an act, right? They're both branded. The names SAFE Act and Save Women's Sports Act have no legal standing whatsoever. They're literally just shorthands for folks like us to be able to refer to them, right? The question here is what makes for a single subject, right? And you can interpret those things broadly, but this is one of the more absurd claims to say that this is not a single subject, right? Because this very much is dealing with the same topic, right? How should the state address this transgender issue? What should our policies be around the transgender issue, especially as it relates to children, right? That's the question that is here, right? And just because you have the word act appearing twice doesn't mean you violated single subject, right? This is very much one topic that has a lot of different aspects to it, but it would make sense that you would address these in one bill, or that you could address these with one bill. And you know, the claims are that a lot of the ACLU and other folks are making about that are just so over the top that they're not serious. Again, this is one of those things that for folks who are involved in this and work in public policy and track these things, you look at their claims in this, you're like, that's legitimately dumb.
Just legitimately dumb. Yep, we got it. We'll soundbite that and send that around to our friends. Well, as we consider other things going on in Ohio, one thing that's been really a big story nationally is these campus protests that have been going on at places like Columbia, NYU, UCLA are kind of the big three that we hear a lot about in the news. But we've also seen that end up a lot closer to home at Ohio State as well. And we're going to have a conversation with Rabbi Yaakov Menken in the second half of our program that's going to get into some of the issues behind it. It's going to be a great conversation. Do tune into that. I think you'll find it really helpful. But just as we consider what we're seeing, Aaron, and especially the Ohio State piece, like what are some of your takeaways, and what are some maybe driving issues or missed opportunities for solutions that could have preceded these types of things that we're seeing?
Yeah, I got to say, one, and the conversation we have with Rabbi Menken, I think, covers a lot of the worldview and ideology behind this that is so hypocritical and so dangerous, right? I remember Maria and I were talking about this the other day. I remember back in a lot of the gay marriage debate days, and even when I was in Arizona, and it was Senate Bill 1060, which was an immigration bill that the state of Arizona tried to pass. And I remember seeing signs at protests at the Arizona State House of folks calling Jan Brewer, the governor, a Nazi, right? Or folks comparing people who believed in marriage between a man and woman as, like Klan members, and you're hate-filled and all this kind of stuff. And the media would throw around these terms like hate group and things like that. They would use these terms so flippantly. And we'd always like, man, this is really dangerous to compare people to Nazis, right? And they would just say, oh, well, we're not saying that they shouldn't be allowed to, but they would just say, well, we're just making a point. But when you use these words enough, then sooner or later, people are going to start taking it to heart, right? And this is where you start seeing violence happen. Is when you throw around these terms so flippantly. And I think we're beginning to see the danger. We started to see that with BLM, and we're starting to see it now with what some folks are calling PLM, Palestinian Lives Matter, which is the same broke worldview and ideology, but that they're justifying just terrible acts in the name because these words are so powerful. And that's what I'm seeing on college campuses, which is that this is the sort of the downstream effect of this hyper language. But I'm also starting to see, I remember I really lost my mind the other day at the OSU protest, because you saw Ohio Democrats, the Democrats in the General Assembly put out a statement calling for the protection of free speech on Ohio's campuses, which rang really hollow to me, because for those who've been tracking CCV for a while, you might remember for about 3 years we were fighting and eventually did pass the Forum Act. It was a free speech on campus bill to protect free speech on campus. And every Democrat voted against the bill to protect free speech on campus. And, we talked about how, we were really pushing this bill at the time because, you had speakers like, Riley Gaines toward the ends, but speaker like Ben Shapiro and others trying to go to speak on campus. And you'd have violent, sometimes riots, started to try to shut these speakers down who were reserving space, paying security fees, all these type of things, invited on campus, and were speaking peacefully and were being either canceled or pushed off campus. I will just say, in light of what's happening on campus now, the protest to Ben Shapiro speaking on campus takes a much darker perspective on it than before. But what our bill did say, Mike, really explicitly was to say, listen, universities can have reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions on protests on campus, right? And free speech on campus doesn't mean you have the right to disrupt class activities, right? And universities have the right to establish speech codes that say, hey, listen, you could protest in these areas and you can use the common areas for those types of things, but you can't protest inside buildings where there's classrooms going on, and you can't interrupt class activity and normal university activity. All of those reasonable time, place, and manner, that's sort of the legal term of art, restrictions on protests and those type and speakers on campus. But what universities can't do is say, hey, we like this speech, we don't like that speech, therefore that speech can't, Ben Shapiro, because you think men are men and women are women, you can't come speak on our campus, right? Like those types of things you can't do. And to see these Democrats, oppose protections for speech on campus, but two, now lump in, trying to build encampments and trying to, get violent on campus. Bring in, we talk about in the bill, like, hey, the universities are allowed to provide for extra speech protections for students. But, universities have a right to say, hey, if you're not paying and enrolled here or working here, we have an extra ability to say you can't come, be a part of these protests or be a part of these activities. And you're seeing, I think, more than half of the people arrested at OSU this week and last week were non-students. Universities absolutely have the right to do that. So again, this is no breaking news, but it's more pure hypocrisy from the left.
Yeah, it's worth remembering that to the point that you made there, Aaron, is that free speech means that you have to be okay with speech that you don't agree with to an extent. And that goes for us too, on our side. Like, if we're advocates for free speech, that means we're going to have to let somebody say something that we don't agree with. But from my perspective, the frustrating thing is the other side of this coin, where we're seeing people kind of lose their breath over, well, we've got to protect free speech. We can't get involved. We can't do anything to stop this, or else we'll be an enemy of free speech. It's like, no, some of these protests have crossed the line from speech to illegal activity. And it is well within your ability as an institution to stop illegal activity on your property. It seems pretty
storming state buildings and occupying them and breaking their, like, again, Mike, I always go back to, like, imagine if pro-lifers did this, right? Like, the FBI would be out, the Department of Justice would be outside their homes putting people in prison, right? Like, it's just the hypocrisy. And again, the fact that the media acts like it's no big deal, right? That was the thing that reminded me of when and I can't remember if we talked about this on the pod, but when the city of Columbus passed their resolution calling for a ceasefire, in Gaza, because that's really going to be the thing. Bibi Netanyahu is now really, because the Columbus City Council told him really
Columbus, Ohio doesn't like this. So
oh my gosh, what are we gonna do? No, but the Dispatch, or maybe it was NPR's, one of their stories on it. It was the Dispatch. Talked about how one of the ways it happened was because these Palestinian protesters occupied, also known as trespassed, and broke the law, and basically shut down City Hall for 2 days on end to demand the passage of this resolution. And there's just no talk of like, hey, that feels insurrection-y to me, right? Yet here's the 15th, 100th story on January 6th. And these guys are literally shutting down democratic processes in City Hall to pass a resolution that has really no effect of anything. But that's not free speech. That's illegal to do those types of things. And there's plenty of opportunities, as we show, like with the March for Life. Again, the team is probably sick of me talking about this. I always get frustrated because we host the March for Life every year, and we have to pay. We do everything right. We pull permits, we get security, we get insurance, we do all of the things that you have to do to legally hold a protest in downtown Columbus, and it costs us literally tens of thousands of dollars to do that. So we can fight for life, and we're happy to do that. But meanwhile, BLM throws a protest and shut everything down and destroy property and doesn't do any of those types of things, and nobody says a word to them.
Well, we are going to dig into, as you mentioned, more of those worldview issues behind what we're seeing on college campuses with Rabbi Yaakov Menken. It's going to be a great conversation. It's coming up next. Hope you stick around and listen to it on The Narrative.
Hey, Narrative listeners. Christians in the marketplace today face more unique and challenging threats than ever before. Businesses are following woke capitalism, chambers of commerce are beholden to social justice, and secular activists are chipping away Christians' First Amendment rights. As Ohio's only Christian Chamber of Commerce, the Christian Business Partnership stands in the gap to advocate for, to educate, and to celebrate Christian business owners. Joining the partnership also allows businesses to provide their employees with healthcare insurance, workers' compensation, and exclusive banking and educational discounts. To find out more and to join, go to cbpohio.org. That's cbpohio.org.
Welcome back to The Narrative. Mike Andrews, Aaron Baer, and pleased to welcome into our conversation this week, Rabbi Yaakov Menken, who is the founding and current managing director of Coalition for Jewish Values, representing over 2,000 traditional Orthodox rabbis in American public policy. His writing has appeared in Fox News, Newsweek, the Federalist, the Jerusalem Post, and other mainstream and Jewish outlets. He's the founding director of Project Genesis, operator of Torah.org, TorahMedia.com, and other leading internet resources for Jewish outreach and education. He's co-founder and editor of Cross Currents, an online journal of Orthodox Jewish thought and opinion, and the author of the Everything Torah Book, an introduction to basic Judaism and Torah thought. Rabbi Menken earned a BSc in computer science from Princeton University before pursuing rabbinic studies at Yeshivas or Somayach of Monsey, New York, BMG Israel, and the Mirrer Yeshiva in Jerusalem. Rabbi, it's so good to have you as a guest on The Narrative today. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Well, as we get started here for our listeners, I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about your organization. What is the Coalition for Jewish Values?
It came into existence because the adherence of traditional Judaism to biblical values was being profoundly misrepresented. We constantly hear that the Jews are left-wing. What people don't realize is that the overwhelming majority of rabbis, educated Jews, carry a traditional education in traditional rabbinics. They are profoundly adhering to traditional values throughout all areas of life, and therefore favor traditional values in public policy. So it's really just the opposite of what you commonly hear in the media, and that's why Coalition for Jewish Values exists. We are robustly pro-life, for example. I know that we were with you in that recent Ohio fight on the abortion bill. We're According to Concerned Women of America, we are the only national Jewish organization that is vocally in the effort, in the fight to keep men out of women's sports, for example. Surprise.
So, Rabbi, we really want to dive into a lot of what's going on in Israel and Gaza and what's going on campus, but I want to kind of stay on this track just for a moment. Could you talk just in general terms, what's the difference between what would be called Reform Judaism and Orthodox Judaism? You in your bio, you talked about representing 2,000, I think it was Orthodox rabbis. So what would be the difference between Reform Jews and Orthodox Jews?
It's very worthwhile to spend a little time pointing that out, or just kind of understanding it. If you go back 300 years, what is now labeled Orthodox Judaism is it. There was, you've certainly heard of the Samaritans, because there's a story of the Good Samaritan in your scriptures, which is, based on that. That was a minor splinter group. There was in the Middle Ages another group called the Karaites that split off. But the corpus of the Jewish world was what is today called Orthodox Judaism. But Reform kind of gained early dominance in America. They came out of nowhere in the 1800s, actually in Germany. They got their start in Berlin because, well, Berlin, Germany is such a good place for Jews. Such a good history there. The Reform movement still has this idea that progressivism is their religion. They said explicitly at their founding, we're rejecting the Talmud, we're rejecting Jewish law, we're rejecting Jewish conduct and practice. What we're in favor of is, quote unquote, unlimited development in the religion of Moses. Well, that's progressivism right there. So over time, I think if you go back to the 1800s and say to one of them, do you know what progressive Judaism is going to be espousing in 2024? And they'd look at you like you were a space alien, not a time traveler. But here we are.
It's amazing what happens when you unhook your truth claims to anything grounded, how far it can float off into oblivion.
That's a very good way of putting it. I would say that of the traditional Orthodox world, I've used the comment, we are the most unwoke demographic in America. Because we have 3,000 years of experience with people telling us, oh, you've got to adopt these new ideas. And Judaism has always rejected this idea that we're going to adopt a new moral compass. And it's amazing when you look in the Bible, the founding fathers of America looked in the Bible, specifically the Jewish Bible, the 5 books of Moses, to determine what those values were, to be offering an environment where peace is valued over warfare, where every human life is sacred, where there's universal justice that no one is exempt from. All of these are biblical ideas. Social responsibility is a biblical idea. The value of family and universal education. All of these come out of traditional teachings. From, again, the 5 books of Moses, the original code that God gave to Moses at Mount Sinai. So we're messing with perfection, literally, when we say we can do better than that.
I want to ask you, while we're on this track, you mentioned that you're a pro-life organization. We had actually heard somebody kind of in our circle, a liberal that we often clash with, mention that, the Jewish perspective on when life begins is that, well, a fetus isn't a person for, and this is a very technical term here, a while, was how they phrased it. So can you just build the Jewish case for the pro-life position for our listeners as well?
Well, there are differences of nuance specifically related to the first 40 days where, and there are certain circumstances where you're going to see a difference of opinion, but overwhelmingly the idea that it is clear that fetal life includes a soul that has already been invested in that individual from God. Which is why God says to Jeremiah, from the womb I have known you and have sanctified you. This idea that that, Rebecca knew that her two children's different natures explained why her pregnancy was odd to her and why she had to go to ask to consult with God to understand what was going on. And she was told prophetically, oh, it's because you're having twins, and one twin has this nature and one twin has that nature. And all of that, again, is the idea that the fetal life is already a life and is already sacred. There's a fundamental difference between termination of pregnancy, which is what happens after 39 weeks, for example, and is sometimes necessary to save the mother, versus this idea that a fetal life is of no value and can be discarded, which is where American law is in so many states, and was the law of the land until Roe v. Wade was overturned. That is a fundamentally un-Jewish idea. And so people try to make a mountain out of a molehill of this. The distinctions, how we approach in vitro fertilization, for example, you can find differences of opinion. You do not find any difference of opinion in claiming that a fetal life is of infinite value. And that has to be dealt with very carefully. But when that soul is invested, there's a couple of different opinions on that, but the maximum is 40 days. So, those 6-week laws, they actually kind of fit the narrative quite close.
So, Rabbi, right after October 7th, we had a friend on who lives in Jerusalem, and he was sort of explaining the situation there. Obviously, the conflict in Israel and in Gaza is still ongoing and is dragging out now for months on end, and who knows when this specific conflict is going to end. But I want to just ask, what is it that you feel like, especially the left in America, or just Americans generally, need to understand about the nature? I feel like that's one thing, is that a lot of folks don't understand the nature of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and especially the religious nature of it. But what do you think people need to understand to get why, one, there's always so much conflict in this area, and why this is such a difficult situation to navigate?
The first thing is how connected these things are. Look at the left, quote unquote. We used to say the left needs to understand. How is it that LGBTQ activists are partnering with Sharia law Muslims? Do they know what happens? Somebody was on Twitter offering to pay an exploratory tour for any LGBTQ person to go promote LGBTQ ideology in Gaza.
Go do Drag Queen Story Hour in Gaza for him. Let's see how that goes.
Yeah, exactly. And I wrote to the guy as a reply that I'll be glad to throw in the body bag for his trip back. Because you're not going to live long going into any Sharia law country and be promoting LGBTQ. So what is it that they have in common? And the answer, and by the way, you can go to the Bible and look at Korach's rebellion, where the rebels didn't agree on what the utopian society was that they wanted to create. All they shared was the desire to tear down the perfection of the Bible. So what you're watching going on is, and this is very hard for the Jewish left to deal with, because the Jewish left is so unbiblical in their own conduct. So much of this hate is based on, well, we're going to go after the Jews first because the Jews had values first. You look at the countries where the Christians are experiencing the worst persecution around the world, and they are, with perhaps the sole exception of Iran, actually, all the other countries are places which are already Judenrein. We got rid of all the Jews. We've expelled them all from Iraq, Syria, and Egypt, to take 3 Middle Eastern examples. And now Christians and Christian holy sites are being destroyed in all those 3 countries, just as examples. That's true also, persecution of Christians in Pakistan or in China. It's all, we got rid of the Jews. Now let's go after everybody else. Because, again, it's anybody who promotes values at the end of the day is their enemy. And that is why Israel is the little Satan and America is the big Satan. It's because, and again, these countries are anything but satanic when they maintain biblical values. So where does this come from? Because of the lie, the big lie. Goebbels mastered in Nazi Germany the big lie. We're going to tell a ridiculous story, and we're going to keep telling that ridiculous story until people start believing it. And then we're going to go on to the next chapter of that ridiculous story. And that is how you get to, and especially in the case of anti-Semitism, they're always genocidal in the end. You see how these so-called peaceful demonstrations have turned horribly violent on campuses around the country. Where did that come from? Because they're always violent in the end. At the end narrative, the end goal is always ethnic cleansing and genocide against the Jews. You look at European history, there were over 100 times, people don't know this, during 1,000 years, this is before the Holocaust, one of the worst mistakes, again, of Jewish leftist American narrative is this idea that the Holocaust was some unique aberration. It was an extreme manifestation of 1,000 years of hate in Europe. And that 1,000 years included 100 different times when kings or mayors or regional chieftains, dukes, whatever, said, we're going to expel our Jews. Yeah. Ulysses Grant wanted to expel the Jews from I think it was Tennessee at some point. He retracted it rather quickly. But there's a pattern here. And now what they're favoring is from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Okay, wait a minute. Let's unpack that for a minute. We're talking about the only country in the Middle East where there's actual freedom. So what do they want to be free of? Jews. In fact, when you put it into the original Arabic, it translates as from water to water, Palestine is Arab. It's entirely Arab. Okay. That's also the big lie. Have you opened the Bible recently? I'm just asking you a question here. Have you opened the Bible recently? Does it talk about that land? Does it spend not just 5 books, but 24 books talking about that land? In fact, it's got a whole bunch of indigenous names that I'm sure are familiar to you. Places like Judea and Israel and Zion, land flowing with milk and honey, promised land, holy land. You heard all these phrases, right? Mm-hmm. How many times did you find Palestine in that book? 0. Okay, so wait a minute. So Palestine, where does Palestine come from? Greco-Roman colonialism. The same people who brought us the Arch of Titus, which is, by the way, the world's largest monument to bigotry and ethnic cleansing in the world. Think about that. All the people talking about tearing down statues, they don't talk about tearing down the Arch of Titus, do they? We, actually, the Jews, like the Arch of Titus being there. It's a reminder that this land actually belongs to us, and Romans ethnically cleansed us out and called it Palestine. So the people calling it Palestine are people who prefer ethnic cleansing and massacre of Jews and expulsion of Jews over the rights of the indigenous population. And that is at the root of this whole conflict. They call it the Palestinian people. By the way, do you know how racist and exclusionary that is? Let's just think about it. That for 2,000 years, to be a Palestinian meant to be a Jew. The only people called Palestinians were, you know how many Arabs were in Palestine when the Palestinian Talmud was written? I'll give you a hint. Hamas can cut off all your fingers. You'll still be able to hold up the right answer. This is just bizarre from beginning to end. It's just racist from beginning to end. So we divide the Arabs into a so-called Palestinian people who don't exist. 75% of the population of Jordan is the same ethnicity. Mahmoud Abbas, in one of his honest moments, said to the Jordanians, we are one people living in 2 states. So he just said to you that this whole narrative about Palestinians needing a state is bogus from end to end, from alpha to omega. It's 0.
Rabbi, you're reminding me of my 94-year-old Jewish grandmother who would always remind me and my siblings and cousins about how sooner or later, when things start going wrong in the world, sooner or later, everyone starts blaming the Jews. And it reminded it as you're talking, I'm thinking about the times we've got to visit Yad Vashem, and one of the things that really comes across as you're walking those halls is the importance. What's so unique about the state of Israel, right? That was founded in 1948, of to actually have a place that Jewish people can be and be protected and be safe, and will actually always exist and fight for the Jewish people. Can you talk about what's so significant about Israel as a nation, right? Along with the land, obviously, but the actual state of Israel. Why is that so important for the Jewish people in particular?
Well, the state of Israel is a modern political entity. The reason why it's important is it is a place of refuge. These people claim that there's an occupation in Palestine when Jews moved back to homes from where they were ethnically cleansed, as recently as 1948, by the way. It's because it's offering them a refuge, a place where they can go, where they can escape. After 1948, and again after 1967, there was pogroms and ethnic cleansing across the Middle East. There are more Arabs in the Israeli Knesset than there are functioning Beit Knessets, which is to say synagogues, in the entire rest of the Middle East. Think about that. There used to be Syrian Jews. There's a whole Syrian Jewish community. Today they live in Brooklyn, Deal, New Jersey, and Israel. There used to be a whole Egyptian Jewish community, 80,000 Jews. They all live in Israel, Europe, and the United States. There used to be an Iraqi Jewish community of 150,000 people. They mostly now live in Israel. Again, some live in the United States. But there's only one country that says, here, we're offering a refuge for persecuted Jews. Where would these guys, if the idiots marching the campus would actually think for a minute, they would recognize they are strengthening Israel by the day, because Jewish leftists who are finally realizing who their real enemies are running to Israel, where to be quote unquote left is to be something entirely different than it is in the United States, where to be left is to recognize that, oh, these people really are out to kill you, and you really have to deal with that. So, you know, that's why they will lie about Israel committing genocide when Israel is defending itself against an explicitly genocidal terror organization that it needs to eliminate because its existence is a threat to every Jewish life on the planet. It's right in their charter. Genocide is their goal. If they don't eliminate Hamas, Hamas is going to repeat October 7th, and yet they call Israel genocidal because they want to protect Hamas, because they want Hamas to do it again. That makes a Jew think, wake up and move to Israel. That's what happens. So if these idiots would realize what they're doing, they would actually stop doing those demonstrations, because they're making Jews move to Israel. They're strengthening Israel's brain trust, because it's smart Jews who are waking up and moving, you know, the university educated who are moving over there as a result of this nonsense. Well, I tell you, as you said, I went to Princeton University. I know another Princeton alumnus, a very left-wing guy. We disagree on everything except Jewish lives. And he now lives in Israel.
Yeah, as we consider what we're seeing across the campuses, you know, certainly Columbia, New York University, UCLA have been some of the main ones that have popped in the news. And with this, as you pointed out, the big lie kind of fueling these protests and things like that. How should we, as Christians, as people who support the Jewish nation, the Jewish people, you know, how can we be using what we're seeing on the news and these protests to bring clarity to that big lie and to speak against it in our you know, neighborhoods and communities and conversations that we're having?
Well, the number one is to recognize this is as clear a contest as the world has ever seen between good and evil. It is absolutely, these guys are justifying rapes, All these so-called feminists are justifying rapes. They are justifying beheadings. They are, it took a couple of decades for Holocaust denial to become a thing. It took a couple of minutes for them to deny that what Hamas live streamed to the world never actually happened. So it is very blunt, it is very blatant, and it is very obvious. You can actually tell the difference between a pro-Israel and an anti-Israel demonstration without mentioning Israel, Palestine, Arabs, Jews, nothing. Because do they fly American flags or burn American flags? Do they clean up after themselves or they commit acts of violence? Do they thank the police or do they fight the police? Are the police there to protect the world from them or to protect them from the world? All of these things you can immediately tell. Now you know which type of demonstration it was. So is it not obvious which side is civilized and which side is the barbarians in this equation? If you don't get that, you're not actually a Christian. I mean, it's kind of like, I know where you got this stuff from. So I can tell you, it's kind of obvious. So that's the first thing. Recognizes between good and evil. That means it's not a Jewish fight. This is absolutely, actually, Christian allies are more important in this fight than Jews because you're so-called neutral observers. You're not neutral because you actually follow the Bible, but it's a neutral thing in that you're not the people being attacked in the street. And you're the one saying, no, that's wrong. No, that's evil. You want to go back, this idea that the Jews are stealing their own Holy Land. That's Laban and Jacob. It's not just Pharaoh. It's not just Haman from the book of Esther. It's back to Laban and Jacob and this idea that, the same guy who swindles Jacob, his kids then accuse Jacob of stealing the property from their father. It's like, that we've seen this before. We know exactly what we're looking for and what we're looking at. And this is it. And like I said, what begins with the Jews never ends with the Jews anyway. You look at where Christians are being persecuted. You've got to get in this fight now because they will be coming for you next, as they already are, by the way. I mean, the efforts to drive Christians out of business across the country, and now Christian doctors. If you won't do an LGBTQ procedure, you can't do reconstruction on a woman who needed a mastectomy, for example. Like that's disgraceful. And that attack is that same attack on biblical values, which is the war on campus, because they're attacking the Jews because they're identified with those same values.
Right. Now, you saw that in when ISIS was really on the move in Iran. And I mean, there was, I think, over 1 million Christians in Iran before ISIS went through, and they've been completely eradicated, essentially, right? And driven out.
And Iraq and Syria.
Yep.
First the Saturday people, then the Sunday people.
Then the Sunday people. That's good.
Say this is from them. They say that's actually their line. First the Saturday people, we're going to go for the Jews, and then the Sunday people will go for the Christians because they worship on Friday.
Rabbi, I want to ask though, that's what we could be doing as individuals, as Americans, and as people. We're coming up on a big election. We want to be informed voters, and I always say, I actually, a lot of people hate primary season. I love primary season because it is the time that you get people to make commitments and to do the right thing. What should we be demanding of our elected officials as people are running for office? We have a big Senate race here. We have obviously a bunch of congressional races in Ohio right now. What are the things we should be pushing our elected officials or wannabe elected officials on how we should be approaching the conflict right now, both in terms of what the federal government should be doing, but also what we want our state governments to be doing as well?
Well, we are Coalition for Jewish Values being a 501c3. I'm going to be careful to talk about values and not do any political endorsements here.
Yes.
However, I'm not telling you to vote against her when I tell you that Ilhan Omar differs from a Nazi propagandist in that she doesn't speak German, that Rashida Tlaib doesn't speak, that's the difference. Yep. You listen to what they are saying and you read Mein Kampf and you say, oh my God, this idea that the Jews are blinding the eyes of the world, that's this. We've got that, like we've seen this before. You should know what you're looking at. The fact that the House of Representatives has made a move now where the entire House of Representatives is focused on the issue of anti-Semitism, and specifically anti-Semitism on campus. Their explicit recognition that these so-called anti-Israel or pro-Palestine demonstrations are nothing more than, this is the Hitler Youth all over again. This is the 1933 narrative about Jews all over again. And if you don't stop it now, it's going to be too late to stop it. Remember that the Nazis took over the Reichstag by democratic vote. You don't want to see that happen. So why the House of Representatives making those moves, the Biden administration is not? Why is the administration not actually in this fight? Why are they not being more vocal? They had an all-of-government strategy to combat anti-Semitism that endorsed two contradictory definitions of anti-Semitism, one of which is flatly anti-Semitic, because it exists to contradict the other about Israel, because that's the most potent form of anti-Semitism today. And again, all of that is just values narrative. You look for elected officials who are going to promote values, traditional values, biblical values. You go back a couple of decades, these were not controversial issues. These were not partisan issues. We get routinely called partisan. I'm like, well, yeah, that's because the people on one political party today call their own predecessors from 50 years ago bigots and phobic. That's why we have this so-called partisan divide over basic biblical values, which should be foundational. They are foundational to America. It would be so much better for the world if these guys would try their utopian vision somewhere else rather than in America. The problem is they can't, because nowhere else do they have a democratic vote. If we're going to keep that away from American policy, that's what we do at the voting booth. We decide on, who is going to be promoting those values. And you look at that whole picture together, and it becomes very clear who you want to be supporting. And I don't even know who the candidates are in Ohio. That's what's great about it. I'm just telling you about policy. That's not a political endorsement. That's not that's just me saying we ought to be voting our values.
Yeah, no, and I think as we see what's going on at these college campuses too, if this is their utopian vision, that you're going to let people say and do whatever they want in the name of free speech, but that ends with things being destroyed and burned and broken, like how does that create?
But what was really great, I think this was at UCLA, they said we didn't have enough police protection from those horrible, violent pro-Israel folks. But meanwhile, one of their platforms is to abolish the police.
As we get set to wrap up here, are there ways that our audience could continue to follow your work and writings as you continue to operate in the public policy space?
Well, we're at CJ Values, as in cjvalues.org and CJ Values on your favorite social media platform. Coalition for Jewish Values. I'm personally Y Menken. I'm most active on Twitter. We really are there just to say it like it is, and just to openly espouse these values. Actually, I heard in the intro, you're affiliated with the National Family Policy Association, and we, state by state, we recognize that the battles that we are fighting are the battles that you are fighting. So, we definitely appreciate the support. We've gotten a lot of support from the Christian community who recognize, if you have a Jewish pro-life voice, that actually does more damage, as it were, to the leftist narrative, because they've been saying all the nonsense they've been saying in the name of the Jews. The same is true with all the LGBTQ advocacy and anti-Semitism. They've been using anti-Semitism as a political cudgel. Even an organization like the Anti-Defamation League, very sadly, has been using its platform to be much, much faster to call out anti-Semitism on the right, even when they're wrong, versus anti-Semitism on the left when it's glaring and obvious. And that's very unfortunate for all of us. That's as unfortunate for Christians as it is for Jews. So we appreciate the help because we're trying to get our message out nationally, because as we've seen here, I hope that your Christian audience will be reinforced in what they should be supporting, what their values should be, by hearing it from us that actually, no, there is not a difference about, America calls it Judeo-Christian ethics. That's not a coincidence. They did get it from the Jews. This idea that it's a battle between Jews and Christians is fundamentally a false narrative that we're hopefully correcting.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of The Narrative, presented by CCV and produced by Wessler Media. If you found today's episode insightful, leave us a review or rating and subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts. We're your hosts, Mike Andrews, Aaron Baer, and David Mahan, and we'll see you next time on The Narrative.